Programs and Membership Coordinator for the DeKalb History Center. Thank you for coming out today on a little toasty evening. But we're excited to have Robert Craig here again for yet another wonderful presentation on architecture. We all love architecture. If this is your first time here at the DeKalb History Center, I want to welcome you. We have an archives exhibit. We do public programs like this. I also lead architecture walking tours through downtown Decatur. If you've come on one of my tours in the last few years, every year is completely different. So this year we're focusing a lot on East Ponce area. All the tours do sell out, so I try to keep it small. So I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. But all of the information is on our website if you want to learn about architecture in downtown Decatur. We also have other evening programs, this week on Thursday we have another book talk about Charles Darwin. And so if you want any other information, we have a sign-up sheet, which is just our monthly email sheet. And I can also talk to you about membership, because membership starts at $30 and it helps to go towards free programs like this. So with that in mind, I will turn it over to Robert Craig.
Thank you. Just a plug about what's coming up in some future lectures, and if you're on the mailing list or members, you'll get some of this, but if not, in August we're going to meet and look at Edwards and Sayward, the architects of schools around the South. That one has turned out to be long enough that I might have to do that in 2 parts. He has work all over South Carolina and Florida and in Georgia. And then following that, at some point, will be look at Willis Denny, who is the architect of Rhodes Hall and has an extraordinary but very short career. And then one that Mercer was saying she was particularly looking forward to, which is a jaunt through ancient Egypt. My wife and I spent some time last December looking at ancient monuments in Egypt, and that has put together what I think is a really fascinating look at that based on that trip. So if you're interested in ancient architecture, even if you're not, you will be after this. Hopefully you'll join us for some of those talks. Walter T. Downing. Little is known of Walter T. Downing's family background, education, early life. He was born April 7th, 1865 in Boston, Massachusetts. His father is not recorded. At the age of 11, he moved to Atlanta with his mother, Anne Downing. At 19, Downing began working for Hannibal Kimball and then apprenticed in the architectural firm of L.B. Wheeler and Company. In 1890, the year he turned 25, Downing established his own architectural firm, W.T. Downing Architect, and began specializing in artistic homes for prominent Atlantans, rapidly developing a reputation as an up-and-coming residential architect in the city. Oops. Just cast my thing over and it changes. In 1899, Downing published the book Domestic Architecture, illustrating 25 of his house designs with 59 tissue-protected photographic plates and 11 floor plans. Residences featured in Downing's domestic architecture included the home of Samuel Inman, who was Joel Hurt's partner in the East Atlanta Land Company and the development of Inman Park, the home of Julia King Grady. This seems to be changing when I don't want it to. Let's see why it's doing this. The home of Julia King Grady, who was the widow of Henry Grady, prominent Atlanta Constitution editor of the 1880s, and the home of Samuel Lumpkin, Georgia State Senator and Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, and finally the home of pioneer Dr. Abner Calhoun. A.W. Calhoun was the father of Andrew Calhoun, who later commissioned his own landmark house by Philip Schutzke on the left and whose wife was the founder in 1923 of the Peachtree Garden Club, the city's first garden club, and also the father of Dr. Finney Calhoun, whose residence, as Ross did, was designed on the right screen, another Tudor revival by Edward Doherty, built in 1917 to 18 in the Tudor revival style that was being popularized by Downing. Indeed, the three Atlanta half-timber Tudor revival houses built at the end of Downing's short life, whose similar design features have long indicated a connection with Downing, but without definitive documentation until this talk prompted my contact in master research sleuth Ken Thomas, retired historian who was there in the second row, with the Historic Preservation Office, who unearthed solid primary documentation of Downing's authorship. Woodhaven, the 1913 Tudor revival house of Robert Maddox, once stood on 73 acres originally purchased from James Dickey, but later subdivided. The eastern portion that contained Maddox's summer cottage and some outbuildings was sold in 1911, and on it today stands Knollwood, Philip Schutzke's Georgian revival house for William Kaiser. Historian Ken Thomas recently found a 1911 advertisement of the R. Mifflin Hood Brick Company in the manufacturing record, listing some of the brick distributors' 1911 contracts, among which is the Atlanta residence of Mayor Robert Maddox, with W.T. Downing identified as architect. The Maddoxes completed their new Tudor revival house by 1913 and lived in Woodhaven until 1962, 3 years before Maddox's death. 20 acres were then sold, including their Tudor revival house, which was demolished and replaced by the Greek revival Georgia Governor's Mansion. Mrs. Harriet High had a Tudor mansion on Peachtree Street from 1916 to 17, also designed by W.T. Downing, and donated in 1926 to the art museum that bears her name, but that was demolished the year after Maddox's house was raised, that is in 1963. The permit issued for constructing the High House on Peachtree Street projects a $20,000 construction cost and records its building from 1916 in August to March 1917, but lists no architect. Research by Ken Thomas, however, cites a June 1912 reference in the Atlanta Journal recording Downing as the architect of Mrs. High's Tudor house. Downing was making something of a specialty in the design of Tudor revival residences in Atlanta. Certainly one of the best of the period was Pine Bloom, the Druid Hills residence of Preston Arkwright. Only recently has this attribution been confirmed, again by Ken Thomas, although numerous secondary sources have named Downing without apparent hard primary evidence. Pine Bloom's current development as Downing Park presupposes and furthers the assumed credit of Downing as the architect, so it's a good thing we've been able to confirm that. Many early references to the house fail to cite its architect. Historians have debated the issue for years, frustrated by journalists who repeatedly have a habit of dropping every name except the architects in their coverage of buildings. Again, the manufacturer records provides a solid design credit to Downing, and Ken Thomas recently discovered the following entry from May 29, 1913 in the manufacturer's record. Quote, Georgia, Atlanta, P.S. Arkwright, awarded contract to C.E. Bowen, Atlanta, the contractor, to erect a dwelling, 2 stories, brick, costing $20,000, parentheses, it may be $30,000, unquote, plans by W.F. Downing, Grant Building, Atlanta, recently noted. Well, the recently noted reference may be to an earlier call for bids on the house, but this May 29th entry indicating the contract award went to Bowen as a builder from Kirkwood, but this 1913 publication significantly also provides us the name of Downing, albeit with the wrong middle initial, as the architect of Pine Bloom. Now, of these 3 Tudor Downing houses, only Pine Bloom survived untouched until last year, that is, when development of the large Druid Hills property began by Joel Reed. The house preserves some of the finest interior features of the style and period, both in terms of architectural detail and space. Regrettably, preservationists can't control what is done to the interior of historic houses, but given the landmark status of Druid Hills, one can only hope that stewardship will prevail over any inclinations to maximize profit at the expense of other long-term values. How naive I could be. Let us hope that Joel Reed is not a hit-and-run developer. Ross Dew, in the same Downing Tudoresque vein, although in this case the design of the house for Finney Calhoun has been attributed to Edward Doherty, with his Nashville partner Thomas Gardner as the associate architect. The Tudor Revival Calhoun House still stands, but now suffering an emaciated new look, a whitewashing seeking to make the house more chic. Instead, renovators have squeezed the oxygen from the more authentic Tudor Revival aesthetic, originally rich in the tectonics of red brick and dark half-timbering. The makeover was the work of Howard Design Studio and normally the more sensitive architect Norman Askins. Now bleached, lime-washed, painted, and anemic, the distinctive Ross Dew is quite literally a homogenized ghost of its former self. And recognizing that it was at the hand of Doherty that Ross Dew was first conceived, a hand has been rudely slapped. Although, as we'll see momentarily, Downing also designed prominent churches in Atlanta, he is credited with notable school buildings at Georgia Tech, Shorter College, the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, as well as commercial buildings and office towers of the early 20th century. But he was especially known for his residential architecture, and with many of his Atlanta houses still extant. When he published his earliest residences in domestic architecture, the architect wrote that the houses, quote, serve to show the style and character of work that has been done in the best residences of this section, unquote. He was indeed an architect of choice for artistic homes, and frequently distinguished the exteriors of even wood frame houses with classical porches and verandas, decorative cartouches, friezes, and ornamental brackets, as well as stucco panels and distinctive trim and detailing. The William Perrin Nicholson House on Piedmont Avenue was published with exterior and interior photographs in Downing's domestic architecture, and still extant in Midtown Atlanta, one of the few residences featured in the book that is still standing. The builder was Julius Fisher, one of the Fisher brothers contractors and a builder at the same time, 1891, of an elaborately ornamented East Lake Victorian house for himself, which is on the right screen there, at 620 Boulevard in Grant Park. Dr. Nicholson was a prominent Atlanta surgeon, dean and teacher at Atlanta's College of Physicians and Surgeons, and president of the Georgia Medical Association. The Nicholson family occupied the house until 1983. The style of the Nicholson house can only be called free eclectic, with its asymmetrical massing, varied fenestration, and room arrangement, its mix of neoclassical decorative motifs, and its varied constructional materials and surfacing, including such design features as decorative columns, pilasters, dormers, window surrounds, friezes, and medallions. Ornamental features include garlands, swags, torches, and shells treated delicately, recalling Adamesque neoclassicism. Downing's favorite shell motif, prominently featured with garlands and torches below an ornate frieze and applied to the tongue-and-groove vertical siding of the bayfront, give rise to the latter naming of the house as Shelmont Bed and Breakfast Inn. Inside the entry hall was carefully detailing the mantel, the overmantel, settee, stair, and stained glass panels, encouraging the description of Downing's residences generally as artistic homes. The hall's chimney piece features a complex arrangement of 18th century English detailing, including paired fluted pilasters with Corinthian capitals, a circular beveled glass mirror, and a shelf bracket supporting the narrow mantel itself. The firebox is surrounded by multicolored square glazed tiles featuring Greek fretwork. A shallow elliptical arch spans the stairwell, which features 5 stained glass panels. The spacious central hall provides access to the other first floor public rooms, a sitting room, a dining room, and a parlor, the former featuring a window seat and prominent antis columns styled in an eclectic composite order. The dining room furniture, including sideboard, dining table, and 8 chairs, were designed by the architect. The period's interest in exotic references is evidenced in the so-called Turkish room, with its reverse dome ceiling and its oriental tile work from which a boar's head projects into the room. Also extant is Downing's 1895 Captain Edward S. Gay House on Courier Street, completed 3 years after the Nicholson House and illustrated in domestic architecture with an exterior view, an interior hall photograph, and a floor plan. The brick residence sits on a rusticated stone base rising 10 courses above Cortlandt Street, and 3 more courses to serve as base for portico columns and porch plinths. Limestone lintels, sills, string courses, and coins further enrich the masonry structure, while 2 ornamental bay windows accent the east side, one centered in the dining room and the other along a secondary entry hall. Each of the principal downstairs rooms has a fireplace. You'll be able to kind of work that out. Some of them are back to back on the plan. The dining room hall and back hall, triple corner stack for those, and fireplaces centered on the walls in each of the outer rooms, the den, the sitting room, the front parlor, and the kitchen. Access and alignment appear to be of little concern as spaces flow organically beyond an entry vestibule to the central hall, which accesses directly the parlor, the sitting room, the den, and the dining room. Downing accommodates domestic service with a highly functional arrangement of kitchen, back stairs, storage, and butler's pantry between the dining room and kitchen, lots of ornament throughout the house. An ample porch extends across the full south face of the house. The Gay House is now the training and counseling center for St. Luke's Episcopal Church, serving the church's ministry of providing pastoral training and mental health services to the community. Other extant Downing houses at the turn of the century include the 1896-7 stone cottage for George Birch Hinman on Piedmont Avenue, and the L-fronted simplified Queen Anne brick houses with Roman Doric porch columns built in 1899 to 806 Piedmont for James Ackers. Downing's residence for Herbert Hobbs in Marietta is at Whitlock Avenue, later became the Whitlock Inn. Some of you may know that building, and is contemporary, dated around 1900. Yeah.
Unless you say so, are these buildings still in existence, or are they torn down?
Some are still there, and if it's a contemporary color photograph, it's still there. If it's an older black and white, it may not be. At the turn of the century, Downing also designed residences in Inman Park. This one is still there. Both of these are. One for Ernest Woodruff, who was the brother-in-law of the developer Joel Hurt. Joel Hurt had moved his own frame cottage to Elizabeth Street in order to establish his presence in his new streetcar suburb. But in 1903, he commissioned a second house, and this one from Downing, built at 163 Elizabeth Street. That's on the right side of the screen. The second home is a yellow brick palazzo, served later as an elementary school for the community, and was later again returned to residential use, and it's still there in Inman Park. The free, eclectic, late-Victorian Queen Anne styled and American four-square houses in Midtown along Peachtree Street near the streetcar lines on or near Piedmont Avenue in Midtown, as well as similar styles in the streetcar suburb of Inman Park, soon turned to more self-consciously historicist styles for homes, notably classical revival after the 1893 Columbian World's Fair in Chicago, and colonial revival, Georgian revival, and Spanish regional vocabularies as the new century progressed. Increased travel and architecture books exposed both architects inclined to early American, including Dutch colonial, to English medieval, to French provincial, to Italian Renaissance forms. After attorney William Wimbish, I see the Women's Club is present. After attorney William Wimbish and his wife returned from the south of France, Mrs. Wimbish suggested that they build their own French chateau on Peachtree Street, and Downing was asked to design it. Echoing the cylindrical bays of Chambord and the wall dormers, steep gables, and turrets of Azay-le-Rideau, Downing's stone Wimbish house is representative of the American historicist style dubbed chateau-esque. It's legitimatized by Whiffin's definition of American styles. In 1920, the house was purchased and adapted for use as the Atlanta Women's Club. 2 years later, architects Marie and Alger added an auditorium and a banqueting hall behind the chateau, and after the upper floor and roof of the original residence was damaged by fire, the revivalist chateau imagery was maintained in the rebuilding. A similar new historicism was felt in the new automobile suburb Annesley Park, developed by Edmund Annesley after 1904, where some 275 acres provided site for cottages, residences, mansions, and other apartment buildings. I may have skipped over. Somehow the slide got missed out of here, so I'll move forward. Itself up. Something's going to miss.
Well, what you're reading is fascinating, so even if there aren't slides, that's
Well, I've got, somehow there has been a miss in the imagery here. What happened there? We'll just have to stare at that for the moment. The entry to Annesley Park has a house that's a kind of classical revival house near the Christian Science Church, which is another of the Downing houses, and a second one on 17th Street for Malcolm Johnson. He also built, and again, I'm sorry I don't have these illustrated. Somehow this got itself a bit mucked up. A second house he built for himself in Druid Hills when he and a friend, Thomas Irwin, decided to buy a double lot, or actually 3 lots in a row, allowing them each to have a lot and a half. And so there's a Tudor revival house that Downing designed for himself and a classical house by Thomas Irwin on the other side.
do those still exist?
They do. Both of them still exist on Oakdale. About halfway up if you're going north on the right side. And it's one of the better Tudor revivals in that section. This catches itself up. I don't know why this is. This is way off here. I'm getting myself. I hope this will catch ourselves up. 2 houses that were not completed until 1918, the year after Downing's death, are among his best known of the manorial, kind of English brick manorial houses. Glenwood's and Craigalachie, north, the first syllable has nothing to do with me. Glenwood's was built for James Dodson and would prove to be especially influential in the continuing practice of Pringle and Smith. It turns out that both Robert Pringle and Francis Smith were assisting Downing in his office as draftsmen. In the earlier period, Francis Smith was still head of architecture at Georgia Tech. Pringle had a small practice on his own. They both were moonlighting, and when Downing needed needed some additional drafting help, they'd hire both of them to do working drawings or to do other drafting. And so my sense when I was writing the book on Francis Smith was that the house on the left top, which is Glenwood's by Downing, became almost a model for a whole series of Francis Smith and Pringling Smith houses, which you see in black and white and color elsewhere on that same screen. These are in and around Buckhead and in Druid Hills. Glenwood is still extant at 1632 Ponce de Leon Avenue in Druid Hills, and it established a formal type of brick medieval English manorial house that Pringling Smith would continue throughout the 20s and 30s. There's a house called Ford Nanny Reynolds on the Prado in Ansley Park. There's a fraternity house that was built for Chi Psi at Georgia Tech, later occupied by Alfred Tau Omega by Pringling Smith, and then several houses in Druid Hills. One of the Paideia houses is of this kind of flavor as well. Downing's 1914 to 18 country house for John W. Grant, known as Craigellachie, was the architect's second house for J.W. Grant. The first appeared in Domestic Architecture, his early book, in 1897. It was a late-Victorian Queen Anne house with a massive chambord, again, inspired cylindrical bay. That's a French element that finds its way into Queen Anne architecture. It's explicitly Chateauesque at the Wimbish House, at the Women's Club, but in Queen Anne architecture, where they have these sweeping cylindrical bays, it really is finding its way ultimately from the same chateau sources. But the second house for the Grants became the Cherokee Town Club on West Pacey's Ferry, known as Craigellachie. It brings a new scale to Downing's neo-medieval residences, less a case of designing for an urban residential street or garden suburb, and more an example of a country house akin to the large mansions being built up and down West Pacey's Ferry, and soon rivaled in Tuxedo Park and on Valley Road. The name Craigellachie references the Grant family home, Arndilly House, Craigellachie, overlooking the River Spy in Scotland, an ancestral home built by David McDowell Grant in 1750 and enlarged in 1850 in a neo-Jacobean style. Downing's Atlanta house is not richly ornamented, but captures in restrained forms the spirit of an English or Scottish manor house, as Charles McIntosh at the turn of the 20th century might have been building outside of Glasgow. Craigellachie presents a wide facade of grouped windows, 3 frontal gables, tall chimney stacks, a broad slate roof. The English manor house forms are uniformly whitewashed, forming a striking elevation beyond the vast and deep green lawn, finding grandeur, as Capability Brown did in England, in the approach view or aspect of a distant house and open landscape with framing trees. The interior features wood paneling and ceiling strapwork, reception rooms and fireplaces, and like the English upper crust, values proper dress for the architecture as well as its inhabitants, the members of the club. You needed a tie to go in there, I think. The estate was converted in 1956 after alterations by Tucker and Howe to become the Cherokee Town Club. The Grant House has lost its original gardens by Hence Reed and Adler, and over the years, due to its new uses, has added multiple tennis courts, a swimming pool in 57, a lower pool in 61, 1965, Clement Ford guided major renovations and additions to the building, and then almost every decade, additional expansion has taken place. The scale of the Grant House and grounds was matched in Chattanooga by Downing houses in 1905 and 1910 for the wealthy Patton and Lupton families. Elizabeth Patton Lupton was the daughter of Zebulon Carter Patton, a veteran of the Civil War, one-time owner and publisher of the Chattanooga Times, and founder of the Chattanooga Medicine Company. He was also founder of the Volunteer State Life Insurance Company and would later commission Downing to build the Hotel Patton, which you see now on the screen, and is still extant in Chattanooga. John Thomas Lupton had moved to Chattanooga in 1887, met Elizabeth, and they were married in November of 1889. After the marriage, Lupton became legal counsel to the Chattanooga Medicine Company and eventually vice president and treasurer. By 1905, Zebulon Carter Patton had commissioned Downing to design the Ashland Farm near Rossville, Georgia, which we see here. And 5 years later, Lupton commissioned Downing to build Lyndhurst in Riverview, Chattanooga. Lyndhurst was a palatial family house, a house of 34,000 square feet on a 30-acre site, said to be the only house in the South to rival Biltmore in North Carolina. Both the Pattons and the Luptons had amassed considerable family wealth. Ashland Farm is a two-story brick house built of non-porous rust-colored brick made in St. Louis. I mentioned that because I'm born and raised in St. Louis, and material carefully mortared to form very smooth exterior surfaces. The house features a monumental classical portico with 12 fluted colossal Corinthian columns. When you use the word colossal in architecture, it means a two-story, not just covering one story, and 16 bays of windows on the front facade. Fenestration is simple, although openings on the first floor have a heavy entablature above and paneling beneath the glazed area. The main entrance features double doors, and above that, a balustraded balcony with heavy brackets. Stone is utilized on the entry stairs. And we can take a brief look on the interior. The entry hall frames a U-shaped staircase with a sweeping balustrade edging stair treads of different widths, each step supporting 3 delicate white painted turned spindles. The balustrades continue down to a curved newel post at the lower level landing and a rear exit. So it not only sweeps up to the second floor, it also sweeps down to the lower level because the first floor is raised off the ground. Outbuildings in Ashland include 2 brick servants' cottages, a brick barn, a mill, a gas house, an open wagon shelter for a Conestoga wagon, all kinds of other kinds of landscaping carried out, borrowing some landscape elements from the Biltmore nurseries in Asheville, in fact. Plantings include deciduous shrubs such as forsythia and spirea, massed around the main house, between the servants' cottages and along the driveways, although none of the original planting remains. Instead, there's a boxwood garden, natural growth, and a sunken garden with a pool there. Elizabeth Patton's husband, John Thomas Lupton, became prominent as a lawyer, an industrialist, and ultimately a philanthropist. When fellow Chattanoogan Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead successfully obtained exclusive rights from Asa Candler to bottle and sell Coca-Cola, the two sought funds to building and operating bottling plants, and John Lupton provided the needed money. The 3 entrepreneurs were the principal investors in the Dixie Coca-Cola Bottling Company, building the first Coca-Cola bottling plant in the United States, in Chattanooga, which opened in 1899. As you may know, Asa Candler didn't think it would ever go in bottles. It was being sold in syrup in drugstores, and so sure, you can have the bottling rights, and boy did they take off with that. It started franchising scores of others. The 3 partners divided the country into territories, and various family members responsible for respective regions sold bottling franchises, and each investor made a fortune. By 1909, there were nearly 400 bottling plants that had been opened. In 1986, not so long ago, Lupton's grandson, John T. Lupton II, sold the family's bottling operations back to Coca-Cola for $1.4 billion in cash.
Is this the house of 32,000 square feet?
Yeah, that's the aerial view and a couple of views. It's been torn down, but I found an old couple of archival shots of it. That's a little ahead of the game, so let's go back. It was for John Lupton that W.T. Downing designed Lyndhurst in 1910 in Riverview, Chattanooga. Said to be the only house in the South to rival Biltmore, as I said. The 34,000 square feet was on 30 acres and included some 30 rooms, including a large ballroom with a pipe organ, a library with mahogany bookshelves, and a frieze depicting the Lady of the Lake, and an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a gymnasium as part of the house. The living room contained an open fireplace and wide doors opening onto an enclosed porch with ferns, palms, furniture overlooking formal gardens, and a miniature lake. Each bedroom on the second floor was styled, referencing a different period of history. The mansion was built of cream-colored brick, forming 18-inch walls ornamented with terracotta. In 1960, it took 6 rounds of dynamite to blow the whole thing up when they were getting ready to get rid of it. Its upkeep had proved too much for after the Lupton's death in 1933. The estate grounds were then developed as 10 single-acre house sites with only the property's name surviving and the family philanthropy, the Lyndhurst Foundation, supporting various Chattanooga causes. On the other hand, the grandfather Lupton's name is on buildings at Shorter College, at Baylor School, and at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, as well as, by the way, the Lipton building at Oglethorpe University here in Atlanta. Lupton, I mean. Downing's earliest educational buildings, however, were at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. In 1901, Downing designed Swan Dormitory and the new electrical engineering building at Georgia Tech's new School of Technology, now called Swan Hall, and the Savant building. Both were long and narrow 3-story brick buildings with stone lintels and sills and string courses separating the top level, and with an overhanging building cornice. A portico of 4 colossal Roman Doric columns without pediment served as an entry porch in the east front of Swan, which you can see on the west screen. West elevations along Cherry Street were restrained with minimal architectural enrichment. Both buildings were sited to flank the 1888 administration building, which we know as Tech Tower, and border a campus green in front of the older building. Tech's Knoll Dormitory, which is now raised, was sited on the opposite north end of the east flank of the campus green, with Grant Field beyond that. So at the earliest years, the North Avenue Trade School had developed a kind of campus center opening to North Avenue, with Swan Dorm and electrical engineering closing the west side of a landscaped square. A similar effort to shape a campus green informed Downing's early buildings at Shorter College in Rome, Georgia, where he designed the first 5 buildings on campus. Downing was commissioned in 1910 to draw plans for an extensive physical plant, and on January 12, 1911, buildings were staked out. An estimated 12,000 to 15,000 freight car loads hauled by a 35-ton locomotive that the college purchased transported the building materials to the hill of the construction site. A spur line constructed by the Central of Georgia to connect to the main rail line led to the campus site. At one stage, the engine lost control and the shorter engine was wrecked in a runaway down the steep track. A loaner substituted until the college's engine could be repaired. It was estimated that 1,750,000 bricks and 6,000 barrels of cement and 1 million pounds of steel were employed in the construction of Downing's 5 Shorter College buildings. Each measured 50 by 200 feet and plan, was uniformly constructed in brick, and featured bare brick columns surfaced months later in plaster. There you can see a postcard of a couple of them there. The Downing buildings at Shorter remain in use, flanking the Portico Library Administration building, which was not built until 1960 to 61, and serving since that date at the hilltop as the hilltop focal point on the campus's so-called upper grounds, beyond the Porter Garden Circle and Alumni Lawn. To the left of the Alumni Lawn is Downing's music building, renamed the Cooper Fine Arts Building. Across the lawn stands the academic building. You can sort of see that in an aerial view this fashion. There, I put arrows to the various Downing buildings, which create these long, narrow compositions. Also in Chattanooga, Downing designed the older buildings at Baylor School, each constructed in brick with stone trim and collegiate Gothic accents. They include, from 1915, the Baylor Tower, the Founders Home, now the Admissions Building, and the Lupton Hall, a boys' residence hall, and Hunter Hall, completed in 1917, the latter housing administrative offices, a floor of girls' dorms, and faculty apartments. Downing's buildings at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga included the neo-Gothic Patton Chapel, an aisleless basilica built in reddish-brown brick with large neo-perpendicular windows and flanked by a bell tower. Downing also designed a complex of connecting structures, including Founders Hall, which you can see also at University of Tennessee, Tudor gateway frontispieces with flanking turrets and clock gable roofs, crenellated parapets, stone trim, window surrounds, flanking turrets. They also built Race Hall in 1917, Cooper Hall in 1918. Race and Hooper were joined by a similar university quadrangle entry. Now, some of these were designed a couple years before that, but built in 1918. That's right around the time Downing died. Then, of course, Downing collaborated with Morgan and Dillon on the early buildings at Oglethorpe here in Atlanta. Oglethorpe was first chartered in 1835 and began operations 3 years later at Midway, Georgia, a small community near the state capital, Milledgeville. Among the school's early students was the poet, critic, and musician Sidney Lanier, who graduated in 1860. The university closed in 1862 due to the Civil War, relocated to downtown Atlanta in 1870, but closed again in 1872. It was rechartered in 1913 as Oglethorpe University laid the cornerstone for its new campus at the present Peachtree Road location in 1915. The administration building, later named Hearst Hall, named after newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst, actually after his mother. He donated land and funds to the university, and of course sponsored the first building to be erected. It became known as the Phoebe Hearst Memorial, 1915. The building recognized William Randolph Hearst's mother, Phoebe Abercon Hearst, a philanthropist in her own right and a feminist and advocate for the education of women. Phoebe Hearst was considered a founder of the University of California, Berkeley, whose original campus design competition she sponsored, and on whose board of regents she served from 1897 until her death in 1919. She was a victim of the Spanish influenza. So the death date is because of that. It's like being a COVID victim, presumably. Hearst Hall, built in gray granite, was designed in a Gothic Revival style and set the tone for Oglethorpe's campus subsequent buildings. Its Great Hall features wood paneling, pointed arches, exposed ceiling beams, and stone fireplace. And in the basement of Hearst Hall is Oglethorpe's Crypt of Civilization, considered the first and most complete time capsule ever created and not scheduled to be open until AD 8113. So if anybody's still around, let me know what's in it. Like Hearst Memorial Hall, Lupton Hall, back to the Luptons of Chattanooga, also designed by Morgan and Dillon and W.T. Downing, although the building's 1919 to 20 construction was after Downing's 1918 death. The building was named for John Thompson Lupton, previously mentioned in relationship to Lyndhurst in Chattanooga. Oglethorpe's Lupton Hall continued the Gothic styling of Hearst Memorial, but it further distinguished by a 42-bell carillon later added to the roof of its tower. The original design called for a clock tower, and initially 4 bells were installed, the largest one weighing a ton. From the tower, College schedules are guided by the mechanical striking of the Westminster quarter-hour chimes and hour toll. 6 additional bells were donated in 1929, allowing a 1-octave console to play limited musical scores. Then, when Lupton Hall was renovated in 1972, the bells were sent for sounding, and 32 new bells added with a steel tower frame installed, so that steel on the top of that tower is relatively recent. On the other hand, a new double-banked console allowed the carillon to play almost any unlimited range of musical scores, with the bells ringing, as well as a quarter-hour Westminster chime. Morgan and Dillon continued the early work at Oglethorpe, building Lowry Hall, which is the university library, which you see here, in 1924-7, based on the main quadrangle at Corpus Christi, Oxford, and also Hermance Stadium, likely designed in 1920, but not built until 1926 to 1929. It was originally projected for a seating capacity of 46,000, but the stadium halted construction in 1929 for obviously crash reasons, and it became more limited in scale and seats about 5,000. In 1919, F.W. Woolworth Company executive Harry Hermance pledged $50,000 for the construction of what would become the stadium with his name on it. His initial donation was intended to fund the first section of an athletic statement and Greek theater. The president of Oglethorpe, Thornwell Jacobs, envisioned an athletic area resembling the Roman Colosseum, but made out of Stone Mountain granite. The constructed section was intended to be repeated with 7 additional parts to form a uniform Gothic revival sports bowl. When Hermance lost his fortune in the stock market crash of 1929, the plan for the larger stadium collapsed, but they had built what's right along Peachtree. In addition to Downing's various school projects, the architect also designed some of Atlanta's most notable ecclesiological buildings, including the church, now the Basilica of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, in 1897 to 98 on Ivy Street, now readdressed as Peachtree. Also, he built Trinity Methodist Episcopal Church on Washington Street and the First Presbyterian Church in association with Eugene Wagendorf. The first church commission came to him in 1897 at the height of his reputation as a residential architect, but with no experience in church design, and he created a masterpiece of neo-Romanesque architecture for the congregation of then mostly Irish Catholics. 17 years earlier, Bishop Gross, the 5th Bishop of Savannah, had established the 2nd Catholic parish in Atlanta. The first was served by the Immaculate Conception Church, and dedicated the church to St. Peter's and Paul, located on the corner of Marietta and Alexander, now Allen Boulevard. And later, the Religious Sisters of Mary established a school, and St. Joseph's Infirmary was established on Baker Street, the ancestor of St. Joseph's Hospital in Sandy Springs. This was the genesis of the whole complex up on Peachtree Dunwoody now from the 1970s, and now owned by Emory Healthcare. In 1897, Marist priests were entrusted with the care of the parishioners of St. Peter and Paul, and in November, the cornerstone was laid for a whole new church designed by Downing. It was dedicated in 1896 and renamed the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and it has extraordinary detail of Romanesque architecture and really fine brickwork. By the turn of the century, classical architecture was gaining widespread popularity following the Columbia World's Fair in Chicago and the Great White City of Beaux-Arts classical structures. Houses, churches, and public buildings began to feature colossal porticos, classical detailing, and a new monumentality. Downing had already shown evidence of his ability to employ this vocabulary, and had featured an illustration as the frontispiece of his domestic architecture, showing his fine arts building for the Piedmont Park international exhibition, the Cotton States International Exhibition in 1895. The building was widely admired, including by James Whistler, according to New York promoter and the fair organizer Horace Bradley. Temporary exposition structure featured heavily carved and decorated friezes, balustrades, column front, one-story matching wings with bowed side porticos. You can see a detail of that portico. The exposition buildings were demolished after the closing of the fair, but Downing continued occasionally to design in classical architecture. For instance, he designed the Beaux-Arts Classical Church in Cartersville, which is named for the evangelist Sam P. Jones, who was a member of the church and who died in 1906, prompting the church congregation to name the Methodist Church as a memorial to him. The Sam Jones Memorial United Methodist Church was constructed of beige brick and granite trim raised over a huge hewn granite base. A wide staircase rises to 3 sections of risers between ante-stone walls, passing through the projected temple front of 4 colossal Corinthian columns, which aggrandize the whole act of arrival. The full metal and stucco entablature that surrounds the pseudo-peripteral, that means it's got some columns suggested down the side as well, forward to cap the 4 facade columns, while the pediment aligns with the basilica's main body. Behind the front colonnade is an entry porch treated as a recessed loggia, and paired pilasters form the first bay. The 2-story sanctuary in the main floor retains its original pews and features fluted Corinthian pilasters, wainscoting, and contains a 2-story sanctuary with its original pews, fluted pilasters, original wainscoting, round arched chancel area, and stained glass head in 1945. Closer to home is Downing's Trinity Methodist Episcopal Church across from City Hall, the new City Hall downtown. Supposedly Downing designed the stained glass as well, and I've not been able to get in there to photograph the stained glass, but here are a couple of views of Trinity Church. It's a basilican church built in reddish-brown brick, laid in Flemish bond, and with strong buttresses tapered to almost pilaster scale, flanking large perpendicular style windows. When the new church was described in the Atlanta Journal in October 1912, the writer observed that the, quote, triumph of the whole construction was the stained glass windows, featuring opaque glass. North windows represented themes from the Old Testament and south from the New Testament. On the east wall, the center window contains symbols of the Trinity, with flanking windows containing figures associated with the formation of the church. My sense is, from my memory, is that a lot of this is, the windows that are in there now are some abstracted windows, but I've got to get in there and take a look again. The third, there's another couple of views of it. The third major church by Downing in Atlanta, the First Presbyterian Church, was designed in association with Eugene Wachendorf. Downing designed the initial 1915 to 19 church complex, including the primarily sandstone narthex, the sanctuary, the parlor, the chapel, initial meeting rooms, and lower portion of the bell tower. The bell tower was completed by A. Tanite Brown, who also designed the brick addition southwest of the sanctuary. With its sandstone window and door surrounds and coining, the addition was compatible with the original character of the sanctuary. Architects Cooper & Cooper added the Winship Chapel in 1931, and their successor firm, Cooper, Barrett, Skinner, Woodbury & Cooper, built the Education and Fellowship Building in 1968. Finally, the whole thing was renovated by Server Barber, Choate & Hertline in 1996, where the same firm's master plan for campus expansion and organization in 2005 sort of put an overall planning conception for the whole complex. And all the structures remain a coordinated array of auxiliary buildings and the like. Now, given all of that, the glory of the church is in many ways its stained glass. It's absolutely beautiful. Some by Tiffany Studios of New York, others by Willett of Philadelphia, and others by the Ansinzo Studios of Philadelphia. These are probably the three outside of Franz Meyer. These are the major firms doing stone glass in Atlanta. Many of these are from 1919 all the way up to the last four added by the Ascenzo Philadelphia studio in 1940. They also preserved some of the original drawings by Tiffany, which is really extraordinary, where you can see the original sketch for the window in pastels, and then the window is still intact in the church. And here is an example of the Resurrection window by Tiffany, and very similar Ascension window, also by Tiffany. There are a few commercial projects which pose some somewhat problematic issues, but helped to sustain Downing's architectural practice during the last 2 decades of his career. 2 projects of relatively small scale, but also the Healey building and the Patton building in Chattanooga are much larger scale. The earliest of this is the Kessler building, with a somewhat complicated building history. Started as the first Bass department store, later Davidson Paxton Stoke building, or the Kessler stores. It was a small shop designed in 1899 by Willis Denny, likely comprising the bottom 2 floors to the still visible cornice of the extant building, and then an arcaded 3-level, 3-base southern section was added about 1912 by Downing. So the bottom of this, I think, is Denny, the upper part is Downing, and then there's even a third architect that adds a little piece off to one side. And more famous or better known because it's been preserved in the MARTA station is the facade of the Eisenman Clothing Company from 1901 to 2, designed originally by Downing, located virtually where the 5 Points MARTA station is now. And by the construction of the MARTA station, they had to, they lost the building but preserved the facade and re-erected it in the, in the MARTA station itself. And then the Hotel Patton, which is Chattanooga's first skyscraper hotel, 12-story block, known today as Patton Towers. It's now converted to affordable housing. It also, interestingly enough, I think Downing was aware of some of what the traditions of earlier avant-garde skyscraper design was all about. I compare it here with the Wainwright building in St. Louis, because there is this sense that there's a ground floor and mezzanine as a base, and then there's a repetition of like offices stacked over top of that, which is the shaft, and then there's a dramatic cornice at the top, which is the capital. So there's an analogy with a column, base, shaft, and capital, and the reflection of this sort of form follows function is reflected by the fact that all the offices are pretty much alike, and so like at least a Greek column, it was built up of like drums that were stacked up on top of each other, and then the capital is where you put a lot of the ornament at the very top and also along the base to give it a sort of foundation. So there is that, I think, somewhat comparable character. And of course, some of these buildings were not as stripped down and as abstracted as the Wainwright building, or even to some degree, even the Patton building. There was an interest in thinking, well, if you're going to build a tall building, then tall reminds people of Gothic, and therefore you ought to style the building as a Gothic skyscraper. And so the ultimate example of the Gothic skyscraper was the Woolworth building in New York, completed in 1912 by Cass Gilbert. It effectively was a Gothic revival skyscraper, with the detailing of the Gothic being like that moment when France was moving from French Gothic to French Renaissance. So it looked, the actual ornament looks like it came off of French chateaus again in detail, but it's Cass Gilbert elaborately working with terracotta to enrich the building to a Gothic. And of course, Downing builds for Atlanta our own Gothic skyscraper, which is the Healey building, with continuous mullions going up the full height, and then this glorious Gothic domed interior space, and other details throughout the building that suggest this interest in Gothicry. Only one tower of an intended two. There was supposed to be two, one on Broad Street and one opposite with the dome lobby sort of as a connector between the two. Well, they only built the one tower, but the Gothic ribbed dome atrium is one of the great special places. Well, on the eve of the Great War, Atlanta lost one of its prominent architects of the turn of the century. W.T. Downing died in 1918 following a tragic accident in Philadelphia. On a family trip to the city of brotherly love, Downing attempted to cross a busy street and was struck by an automobile and died of his injuries on November 1st, 1918. He was 53. He was returned to Atlanta and buried in Westview Cemetery, whose west gate, according to Jeff Clemens, was designed by Downing in 1891. This was relatively new to me. I think that's interesting. And of course, Downing's eldest son, his son, I don't know if he had more than one, but his son, John Francis Downing, was also an architect, and he continued his name in the profession during the 1920s, building such works as the Sun, as the Cyclorama building in Grant Park, the main building of the Kirkwood Elementary School in the 1920s, which were later expanded by some other architects, and residences for his mother, which we see in the bottom view on the left, in Druid Hills, still extant, a little picturesque half-timbered cottage on Springdale, and also another for Edward Dunlap, a gabled brick neo-Georgian house on Oakdale Road in Druid Hills. It closes out the Downing name through the sun, but hopefully we've had a kind of a general sense of the variety of one architect's work in what was a life of probably 20 or 30 years of practice, but dead by his mid-50s, Walter T. Downing. Thank you very much.